June 5, 1944, the night before D-Day. Across southern England, the darkness vibrates with engines. Airfields from Dorset to East Anglia thrum like living machines. Searchlights probe low-cloud ceilings. Ground crews move under sodium lamps, faces pale in exhaust glare. The smell of oil, hydraulic fluid, and cut grass hangs thick in the air. On the runway stand lines of aircraft so long they disappear into the mist. Dakotas heavy with paratroopers, Thunderbolts and Mustangs waiting for dawn, bombers loaded for the first light missions that will soften Normandy's defenses. Every few minutes, another squadron taxis out, propellers flashing silver arcs in the rain. In distant chateaux along the French coast, German officers hear the low thunder rolling across the channel. They mistake it for weather, not realizing they're listening to an industrial storm unlike anything in history. Behind this single night of noise lies an invisible empire of factories: Detroit, Seattle, Long Beach, Buffalo, each a furnace of motion and metal. In 4 years, they've built 100,000 American aircraft. The sky itself is about to become a battlefield, and the men who command Germany's armies are about to learn what that number truly means. The path to that night began years earlier, before there was any Normandy, before the United States had even entered the war. In 1939, the U.S. Army Air Corps was smaller than the Polish Air Force. Its frontline inventory stood at fewer than 1,800 aircraft, most of them obsolete biplanes or underpowered trainers. America possessed neither the doctrine nor the infrastructure to wage an air war on a continental scale. The coming transformation would be nothing short of industrial alchemy. When war erupted in Europe, President Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that the next conflict would be decided in the air. In May 1940, he called for the production of 50,000 aircraft per year, an unthinkable number at the time. The nation's industrialists laughed in disbelief. No American factory had ever produced even a tenth of that in 12 months. But Roosevelt wasn't asking for possibility. He was dictating necessity. The conversion began immediately. The War Department established the Office of Production Management, followed by the War Production Board, to harness civilian industry. Automobile giants, Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, were ordered to retool for war. Across the country, assembly lines once devoted to sedans and farm equipment began producing wings, fuselages, and radial engines. A new species of factory worker emerged, clad in denim and goggles, the machinists and riveters of total war. By late 1941, as the attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America fully into the conflict, the groundwork was already laid. Henry Ford's Willow Run plant near Ypsilanti, Michigan, became the symbol of this transformation. Designed to build a bomber every hour, it stretched more than a mile long. Day and night, tens of thousands of workers, many of them women replacing men gone to war, assembled the B-24 Liberator, an aircraft that would soon form the backbone of the 8th Air Force. The numbers began to climb. 1941, 19,000 aircraft. 1942, 47,800. 1943, $85,000. The total output defied belief. Entire towns sprang up around the plants: Long Beach for Douglas, Burbank for Lockheed, Seattle for Boeing. The scale turned raw materials into rhythm. Steel became form. Form became flight. Yet industrial might alone was not enough. The United States had to create a vast logistical network to deliver, fuel, maintain, and crew these machines. Training fields spread across the Midwest and South: Maxwell Field, Randolph, Luke, Perrin, Tuskegee, each pulsing with cadets. The Army Air Forces grew from 26,000 personnel in 1939 to more than 2.3 million by 1944. The U.S. had become an air power nation. When the first American squadrons arrived in Britain in 1942, they joined a Royal Air Force hardened by years of survival. The partnership between the 8th Air Force and the RAF's Bomber Command created a dual strategy: daylight precision bombing by Americans, night saturation raids by the British. The skies over Germany would never sleep again. But these early missions came at staggering cost. Flying deep into enemy territory without escort, the heavy bombers suffered losses of up to 20% per raid. In the fall of 1943, entire formations vanished over Schweinfurt and Regensburg. For the men who returned, the sight of empty bunks said more than any briefing. The Luftwaffe remained formidable. Its fighter groups, Jagdgeschwader 26, JG-2, JG-54, filled with veterans who had learned their trade in Spain, Poland, and the Battle of Britain. The Americans were learning too. They were building not only planes, but doctrines, formation discipline, target selection, escort coordination. Each failure became data. Each sortie refined a system. By 1943's end, the U.S. had more aircraft than all the Axis powers combined. Behind that statistic stood something new in human history: the full synchronization of democracy and mass production. Assembly lines had become strategic weapons. Still, it wasn't enough to simply build planes faster than they could be shot down. The Americans needed to dominate the sky itself, to choke German industry, cripple transportation, and erase the Luftwaffe's ability to resist. That transformation, from industrial potential to operational supremacy, would take place in the next critical year, leading directly to D-Day. By early 1944, the skies over Europe were no longer a duel. They were a campaign of annihilation. The United States Army Air Forces had matured into the most complex aerial machine the world had ever seen. From bases stretching across southern England, thousands of aircraft launched daily against the heart of Nazi Germany. What had begun as experimental daylight raids 2 years earlier had evolved into a relentless, mathematically coordinated onslaught. The plan guiding it all was Operation Point Blank, conceived at the Casablanca Conference in early 1943. Its purpose: destroy the German aircraft industry, neutralize the Luftwaffe, and prepare the way for the Allied invasion of Western Europe. It was the bridge between industrial power and battlefield control. To execute this plan, America's assembly lines had already reached their crescendo. Factories no longer built individual aircraft. They built fleets. Each month, the United States was producing more than 7,000 planes of every type: P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings, P-51 Mustangs, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, C-47 Skytrains, and dozens more. By mid-1944, over 100,000 U.S. aircraft had been built and delivered to combat units or reserves since the start of rearmament, a figure that astonished even Germany's intelligence analysts. The Allied bomber streams were now rivers of aluminum, flowing over Europe day after day. But the heart of the air war was not only the heavy bombers, it was the long-range escort fighters that finally allowed them to reach their targets and return. The arrival of the North American P-51 Mustang, fitted with the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, changed everything. With drop tanks extending its range beyond 1,600 kilometers, the Mustang could now fly with the bombers all the way to Berlin. The Luftwaffe was forced into constant battle. Each engagement costed irreplaceable veterans and precious fuel. German aircraft plants at Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and Wiener Neustadt were pounded repeatedly. The attrition that had once been America's burden now became Germany's nightmare. Then came Big Week, February 20th to 25, 1944. In 6 days, more than 3,800 Allied bombers and 2,500 fighters launched waves of attacks on aircraft assembly plants, engine factories, and airfields across the Reich. The goal was total paralysis of the German aircraft industry. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the effect was decisive. Production was disrupted, supply chains shattered, and hundreds of German fighters destroyed in combat. For the first time, the Luftwaffe lost control of its own skies. The consequence rippled beyond Germany's borders. By March, Allied reconnaissance showed the enemy's air defense network, the Kammhuber Line, fragmented and collapsing. German radar operators struggled to track the vast bomber formations. Fighter controllers could no longer coordinate intercepts effectively. The Reich's once proud Jagdgeschwader groups were now burning through fuel reserves faster than they could be replenished. Meanwhile, American logistics shifted toward the next phase, the preparation for Operation Overlord, the invasion of France. The transportation plan, directed by Air Marshal Arthur Tedder and Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, reoriented the air campaign. Instead of striking deep inside Germany, the bombers turned west, hammering rail lines, bridges, marshalling yards, and fuel depots across northern France. The aim was clear: isolate the battlefield, delay reinforcements, and blind German commanders once the invasion began. For the crews flying these missions, the tempo was unrelenting. Airfields in East Anglia and southern England operated around the clock. Maintenance crews worked in sleet and mud, turning wrenches by flashlight. Replacement parts arrived faster than they could be fitted. Each night, new aircraft rolled off the production lines in Michigan and California, were test flown, ferried to Newfoundland, Iceland, and Scotland, and joined squadrons in Britain within weeks. The pace defied comprehension. In Berlin, Luftwaffe officers stared at intelligence estimates with disbelief. How could a single nation produce this many planes, train this many crews, and sustain such losses without slowing down? Even the Reich's armaments minister Albert Speer admitted privately that Germany could not compete. His factories had produced 39,000 aircraft in 1943, but they lacked pilots, fuel, and raw materials. By the spring of 1944, the U.S. had not only achieved numerical superiority, it had achieved operational momentum. The Allies could replace what they lost faster than the Germans could react. For the Luftwaffe, every battle was now a retreat fought in the air. As the invasion drew near, the meaning of 100,000 planes was no longer theoretical. It was visible every morning over England, an ocean of aircraft, engines running, waiting for the signal to cross the channel. The storm was about to break, the human and industrial machine. Behind the roar of every engine stood hands, millions of them. The story of America's 100,000 aircraft was not written in flight logs, but in factory time cards. Between 1940 and 1944, entire cities turned into foundries of wings and rivets. Detroit became the arsenal of democracy. California's aircraft corridor, Los Angeles, Burbank, Long Beach, glowed around the clock. The day shift built fuselages, the night shift installed engines. In Buffalo, Lockheed workers could recite assembly diagrams by heart. Over 1 million women joined this new industrial army. Rosie the Riveter was not propaganda, it was the truth. Women formed nearly 40% of the aircraft industry workforce by 1943. They learned to weld aluminum, read blueprints, calibrate gauges. At Willow Run, 40,000 employees turned out a B-24 every hour by the war's height. In Inglewood, Douglas Aircraft doubled its floor space in 6 months. The coordination of raw material, transport, labor, and engineering reached a scale no other nation could match. For every combat crew over Normandy, dozens of workers back home ensured their survival. They were the unseen squadron: engineers, toolmakers, draftsmen, factory nurses, cafeteria cooks, bound together by one purpose: make more, make faster, make better. The Luftwaffe fought with aces. America fought with engineers. The tactical evolution. The power of 100,000 aircraft was not measured by numbers alone, but by how intelligently they were used. By 1944, Allied air operations had evolved into a layered system. At the top level, the 8th Air Force conducted deep penetration raids by day, hitting industrial centers, oil refineries, and aircraft factories. The RAF Bomber Command struck by night, lighting the same cities with fire. Closer to the front, the 9th Air Force and the RAF's 2nd Tactical Air Force prepared to support the coming invasion. Their mission was immediate: destroy rail networks, isolate the battlefield, and obliterate German armor once it began to move. Fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt and the Typhoon became flying artillery, sweeping bridges and convoys with rockets and .50 caliber fire. Tactics matured rapidly. American pilots, once dependent on tight bomber formations, now hunted aggressively. Free sweeps deep into occupied France shredded German logistics before they reached Normandy. Ground controllers directed close air support via mobile radio, pioneering what modern air forces now call joint operations. The result was air supremacy, not just over battlefields, but over supply lines, fuel depots, and command posts. The Luftwaffe, forced to respond, bled itself dry. Each new pilot they rushed to the front faced an opponent who had already fought 100 sorties. The technological engine. The leap from 1939 to 1944 was not incremental, it was revolutionary. The United States fused engineering brilliance with production scale. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double WASP engine powered both the Hellcat and the Thunderbolt, delivering raw, reliable horsepower at altitude. The Wright Cyclone gave bombers their endurance. But the war's true technological miracle was the P-51 Mustang. Originally designed in Britain, it became the defining weapon of Allied air power when fitted with the Packard-built Merlin engine, a seamless marriage of British design and American manufacturing. Its laminar flow wing reduced drag, allowing it to fly higher, faster, and farther than any fighter before it. With external drop tanks, it escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back, then strafed airfields on the return. Technological synergy turned every aircraft into a component of a wider system. Improved radios and radar guidance linked fighters to controllers miles away. The SCR-584 radar coordinated anti-aircraft defenses with mathematical precision. The Norden bomb sight enabled daylight precision attacks once deemed impossible. Perhaps the most transformative development was standardization. Every bolt, wire, and engine part was interchangeable. A damaged P-47 landing in Normandy could receive a new wing sourced from a Michigan factory within days. Logistics had become an engineering discipline. The Axis powers could innovate, but they could not mass-produce innovation. The Allies, led by American engineers, did both. Together, these three angles, industrial, tactical, and technological, formed a war machine greater than the sum of its parts. Each reinforced the other. Factories produced the aircraft, doctrine gave them purpose, and technology made them unstoppable. By the spring of 1944, the system was fully synchronized. The result would soon roar across the skies of France and render entire divisions of the Wehrmacht powerless beneath its shadow. The remaining question was one of leadership and endurance. Could the architects of this air empire maintain its rhythm through the most complex invasion in history? Leadership and doctrine. At the center of America's aerial revolution stood a handful of commanders who understood how to turn technology into doctrine. General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, was the architect. A student of air power since World War I, he believed that industrial output meant nothing without coordination. Under his leadership, the Air Forces became a global system. Training, logistics, supply, and command fused into a single instrument of war. Beneath him, General Carl Spaatz and General Jimmy Doolittle shaped strategy and execution. Spaatz, quiet and analytical, directed the combined bomber offensive with mathematical precision, ensuring every sortie served a larger strategic goal. Doolittle, remembered for his Tokyo raid, proved equally bold in Europe. In early 1944, he changed the fighter escort doctrine. Instead of tying fighters rigidly to bomber formations, he gave them freedom to seek and destroy the Luftwaffe wherever they found it. That single decision crippled Germany's air defenses. On the tactical side, Air Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory and Air Chief Arthur Tedder orchestrated the transportation plan that made D-Day possible. Their cooperation with Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force ensured that the air campaign served the invasion, not just statistics. Leadership in the air war was not about heroics, it was about systems thinking. The Allies learned that command structure could be as decisive as 1,000 aircraft. The enemy's collapse. While Allied air power soared, the Luftwaffe was collapsing under the weight of its own brilliance. Germany had entered the war with the best-trained pilots and the most advanced aircraft in the world, the Bf-109, the Fw-190, and the legendary aces of the Jagdwaffe. But those advantages required time, fuel, and experience, three things the Reich was running out of. By 1944, Allied bombing had reduced Germany's aviation fuel production by over 80%. The great synthetic plants at Leuna, Bohlen, and Politz burned night after night. Without fuel, training flights stopped. Rookie pilots arrived at the front with as few as 60 flying hours. Many died on their first mission. The numbers tell the story. In 1943, the Luftwaffe lost 15,000 aircraft. In the first 6 months of 1944, it lost nearly the same again. The destruction was no longer linear, it was exponential. Every aircraft destroyed meant not just the loss of a machine, but the death of a trained crew that Germany could not replace. Even worse, the Reich's command structure was fracturing. Hermann Göring, once the Luftwaffe's dynamic founder, had become detached and ineffective. His subordinates argued over tactics, production priorities, and defense zones. The morale that once carried the Luftwaffe through the Battle of Britain was gone. When German intelligence learned that the Allies had produced more than 100,000 aircraft before D-Day, disbelief turned to resignation. They realized the war in the air was no longer contestable. It was mathematical. Logistics, the hidden front. For every sortie over Normandy, a river of logistics flowed unseen beneath it. Airfields, depots, oilers, and transport ships were as vital as engines and wings. By 1944, the United States had created an airborne infrastructure stretching from Kansas to Kent. Southern England had become one giant airfield. The countryside was studded with over 300 bases for bombers and fighters. Temporary Advanced Landing Grounds, ALGs, were built near the coast, designed to receive aircraft once the invasion began. American engineers poured thousands of tons of steel mesh for runways, laid pipes for fuel, and erected portable hangars under camouflage nets. Behind this web was an oceanic supply chain. Each month, Liberty ships carried thousands of aircraft crates, engines, and spare parts across the Atlantic. In the UK, logistics officers managed inventories with a precision worthy of a modern corporation. A fighter engine could be removed, replaced, and tested within 24 hours. Even damaged airframes were shipped to repair depots, rebuilt, and returned to combat within weeks. Fuel alone was a logistical masterpiece. Tankers pumped aviation gasoline from depots in Wales through a network of underground pipelines to forward bases. When the invasion began, these pipelines would extend across the Channel, ensuring the Allied air umbrella never dimmed. This logistical strength turned air power into permanence. The Luftwaffe could win a battle, but not sustain a campaign. The Americans, by contrast, could lose 100 planes and launch 100 more the next morning. By June 1944, every one of these forces, leadership, enemy decline, and logistics, converged on a single moment. The factories had delivered, the doctrine was proven, and the skies belonged to the Allies. The last barrier between air power and victory was the invasion itself. On the eve of D-Day, 11,000 Allied aircraft stood ready across Britain. German commanders looked at their maps and realized they had no answer left. The stage was set for the most coordinated aerial operation in human history. The summer of 1944 began with thunder. not from the sky, but from the engines of an empire in motion. Across the airfields of southern England, 100,000 aircraft, the cumulative strength of American industry, waited for their moment. Each plane, each part, each pilot was a link in a chain stretching from Detroit and Dallas to Dover and Devon. For months, the Allied High Command had prepared the air war that would make the invasion possible. General Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, calculated that the first days of Operation Overlord would require total air control. No German aircraft could reach the beaches. No reinforcements could move by daylight. It wasn't simply about air superiority, it was about domination. The skies in early 1944 had already shown a preview. In February, during Big Week, American bombers destroyed a third of Germany's aircraft production capacity. By April, Allied fighters were roaming the skies above Western Europe at will. They swept railways, convoys, and airfields. The Luftwaffe, once the sharpest weapon in Hitler's arsenal, had been reduced to fragments, pockets of resistance clinging to dwindling fuel stocks. On May 19, 1944, the Allied air forces issued their final directive. The air must be ours. Every available squadron, British, American, Canadian, Polish, Czech, was ordered to strike at the arteries of occupied Europe. Rail lines from Paris to Lille, bridges over the Seine, fuel depots near Amiens and Rouen, all became targets. By June 1st, northern France was a landscape of twisted steel. Wehrmacht supply columns were forced onto country roads by night, hiding beneath trees by day. As the first week of June began, the German commanders knew something was coming, but not where or when. Reconnaissance flights over England returned reports of thousands of aircraft concentrated near the southern coast, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-51 Mustangs, C-47 Skytrains, and heavy bombers stretching as far as the eye could see. Luftwaffe officers in France forwarded the images to Berlin. The reaction was disbelief. No nation could field such numbers, they insisted. The photographs must be doctored. Then came the morning of June 6, 1944. Before dawn, Operation Neptune, the air component of the D-Day landings, began. Over 800 C-47 transport aircraft filled the sky, their navigation lights flickering in the darkness. Inside them sat paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions, men who had trained for this night for 2 years. Behind them came 4,000 gliders carrying jeeps, guns, and engineers. The air above the channel glowed with the slow pulse of navigation beacons and tracer fire from ships below. At first light, the bombers arrived. B-24, Liberators, and B-17, Flying Fortresses, thousands of them, filled the upper atmosphere in formations so vast they darkened the sea. They dropped their payloads on German batteries, radar sites, and road junctions. Even when bombs missed, the effect was crushing, the psychological weight of endless engines. The Luftwaffe's response was almost non-existent. A handful of FW-190s and Bf-109s scrambled from airfields near Caen and Cherbourg. Most were intercepted before they reached the coast. One German pilot, Major Joseph Priller, later recalled the site of the invasion armada. The sea was covered with ships. The sky was full of planes. We flew over it once, fired a few bursts, and turned away. It was all we could do. From dawn to dusk, Allied aircraft ruled unchallenged. Over 14,000 sorties were flown that day alone, fighters, bombers, transports, and reconnaissance planes operating in perfect orchestration. Ground commanders called for airstrikes through mobile radios, and within minutes, the targets vanished in columns of smoke. Every German convoy, every bridge, every tank that dared move in daylight was attacked. For the Wehrmacht, movement itself became a liability. German divisions that might have reinforced Normandy were trapped by destroyed railways and strafed roads. Tanks were abandoned for lack of fuel. Commanders could not communicate, their signals drowned in the roar of Allied engines. That night, as the first American troops secured the beachheads, the airfields of southern England were still alive. Ground crews refueled, rearmed, and repaired, preparing for the next day's assault. For them, victory wasn't measured in territory, it was measured in flight hours, sorties, and machines that returned home. By midnight over France, the sound of aircraft was constant. Thousands of engines beat in unison, echoing through the low clouds, a symphony of steel and discipline. The invasion had succeeded because the air had already been conquered. Yet, for the men directing Germany's defense, the scale was only beginning to sink in. Reports from across France painted the same picture. No supplies moving, no reinforcements arriving, no Luftwaffe left to fight. The shock was absolute, and it would deepen over the following days. As the full might of the Allied air machine bore down on the retreating German armies. The days that followed D-Day turned the skies of France into a living demonstration of industrial warfare. What German generals witnessed from their command posts was no longer a traditional battle. It was a mechanical tide, an unbroken procession of aircraft that erased the concept of daylight movement for the Wehrmacht. By June 8th, Allied air forces were launching nearly 17,000 sorties a day across the invasion zone. Every hour, from dawn until dusk, bombers and fighter bombers crossed the channel in waves so thick that radar operators struggled to count them. The 9th Air Force, under General Louis Brereton, struck road convoys, tanks, and artillery positions. The 2nd Tactical Air Force, flying from British bases, covered the flanks and harassed German reinforcements along the Seine. Every type of aircraft played its role. Thunderbolts strafing columns of trucks, Typhoons firing rockets into panzer divisions, Mustangs hunting trains, and Lightnings photographing every mile of occupied France. In the skies above the beachhead, the air itself seemed to belong to the Allies. Even German soldiers joked bitterly, "If you see a silver plane, it's American. If you see a blue plane, it's British. If you see no plane, it's night." For the Luftwaffe, D-Day was more than defeat. It was humiliation. In the first 48 hours of the invasion, fewer than 300 German sorties were recorded against more than 14,000 Allied. Entire fighter wings were grounded for lack of fuel. Pilots who managed to take off faced radar-guided intercepts and superior numbers. One after another, airfields in northern France were bombed into silence. By June 10th, the once proud Jagdgeschwader Sussex Schlageter, which had fought since the Battle of Britain, reported just 40 operational aircraft. Meanwhile, Allied engineers were turning Normandy itself into a new base of operations. Within days of the landings, the first Advanced Landing Grounds, ALGs, were constructed just behind the beaches, temporary runways built from pierced steel planking. By June 12th, P-47s were landing in France, refueling, and taking off again within hours. Air power had gone amphibious. On the ground, the effect was devastating. German convoys trying to move through the French countryside were annihilated. Bridges collapsed under rocket fire. Columns of armor burned for miles. The Luftwaffe's remaining reconnaissance units reported what they saw with despair. Continuous fighter-bomber attacks, impossible to move by day, morale of troops collapsing. By mid-June, the German High Command realized that every operational plan they had drafted, every timetable, every reserve movement, was meaningless. Air interdiction had fractured their command structure. The Panzer Lehr Division, Germany's elite armored unit, lost half its vehicles before even reaching the front lines. Supply trains were stranded on shattered rails. Ammunition depots exploded one after another under relentless bombing. In Berlin, Albert Speer presented Hitler with production reports. Germany was still building aircraft, but they couldn't reach the battlefield. Of the roughly 1,000 planes produced in May, fewer than 400 were operational by mid-June. The rest sat on airfields without fuel or trained crews. The contrast was staggering. In the same month, American factories rolled out more than 8,000 aircraft, from fighters to transports. Every hour of every day, somewhere in the United States, another plane was being born. Germany had never faced an enemy that could replace its losses faster than the war could destroy them. The psychological effect on German commanders was profound. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, overseeing the defense of France, traveled constantly under air attack. His staff cars were bombed repeatedly. On July 17th, one such attack near Leverot critically injured him, forcing his evacuation and ending his command. For the German troops below, the message was clear: no one was safe. Every report reaching the OKW, Germany's high command, echoed the same phrase: Luftüberlegenheit des Feindes total. Enemy air superiority total. The term no longer described a tactical condition, it described a reality that reshaped the battlefield itself. The Luftwaffe still tried to fight back. On June 20th, a small formation of FW-190s struck Allied shipping off the beaches, sinking a single landing craft before being shot down to the last plane. It was a symbolic gesture, a flicker against a sun. By July, the Allies had achieved the unthinkable. They had not just seized a foothold in Europe, they had established an unbroken aerial highway from Britain to France. Over 1.5 million men and 250,000 vehicles had crossed the Channel under a canopy of American and British aircraft that never ceased flying. For the German officers watching from their bunkers, the realization was crushing. They had once believed industrial scale could never translate into battlefield control. But now they saw the truth firsthand. Production lines had become weapons. Factories thousands of miles away were dictating the outcome of battles they could not see. D-Day was the proof. The machine had won the sky, and beneath it, the Reich was beginning to crumble. When the smoke of June settled, the figures were staggering. In the first 6 weeks after D-Day, Allied aircraft had flown over 480,000 sorties in support of Operation Overlord. They destroyed or damaged more than 10,000 vehicles, 2,000 locomotives, and virtually every rail bridge across northern France. German logistics, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, had ceased to function in daylight. From the beaches to the hedgerows, the Allied armies advanced beneath an unbroken sky of friendly aircraft. For the infantrymen below, the low growl of a P-47 was as reassuring as the sight of a flag. Pilots flew until exhaustion, landing at forward strips caked with dust to refuel and take off again within minutes. Each mission blurred into the next. The sound of engines became the sound of inevitability. To the men on the ground, air power felt omnipresent. To the German defenders, it felt divine, an angry, mechanical god descending from the clouds. Convoys moved only at night, headlights off, each turn of a wheel risking discovery. Even retreat was perilous. The Luftwaffe had become a rumor, its once famous aces grounded by empty tanks and empty skies. In July, the balance of attrition became irreversible. Allied reconnaissance showed Luftwaffe fighter strength in the west had fallen to fewer than 300 serviceable aircraft. Those that remained were scattered across damaged airfields and constantly hunted by Mustangs and Thunderbolts. The Germans had lost not just planes, but the ecosystem that sustained them: fuel, mechanics, spare parts, and experienced instructors. Meanwhile, the American industrial furnace roared on. The War Production Board reported in July that the United States had manufactured more than 103,000 aircraft since January 1940. The number itself mattered less than what it represented: capacity. Even if half those planes were gone, destroyed, or obsolete, the system that produced them was alive, humming, and unstoppable. On the front, air power began to shape the ground battle directly. During Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy in late July, Allied bombers obliterated the German lines near St. Lo. The thunder of 1,500 B-17s and B-24s flattened entire sectors, allowing Patton's Third Army to surge east. German armor, trapped in daylight, was hammered from above by rocket-armed Typhoons. The battlefield itself had changed texture. Roads were craters, hedgerows were dust, columns were flame. For the German High Command, reports from the front read like autopsies. Generals spoke not of tactics, but of paralysis. We cannot move, we cannot supply, we cannot fight under this sky. One staff officer compared it to trying to swim against a waterfall. The once feared blitzkrieg, the art of movement, had been turned inward. Within Hitler's headquarters, disbelief hardened into despair. No order could counter a system. No speech could summon fuel from bombed refineries. German intelligence attempted to calculate Allied production figures, but stopped when the estimates exceeded comprehension. They had entered a war of infinite airplanes. For the Americans and their allies, the psychological transformation was just as profound. The same crews who had once flown through swarms of German fighters now crossed the Channel unopposed. Pilots who had expected to die over Schweinfurt were living long enough to plan post-war careers. Confidence, once fragile, had become doctrine. By the time Paris was liberated in August 1944, Allied air power had become a permanent presence, a moving front line of aluminum, engines, and endurance. Every bridge destroyed, every train halted. Every German tank burning by the roadside traced its lineage back to a blueprint drawn in an American factory. The victory was not sudden, nor was it glamorous. It was cumulative, built hour by hour, shift by shift, wing by wing. In a war that had begun with the myth of blitzkrieg, the Allies had answered with something even faster: industrial velocity. By autumn 1944, the Luftwaffe was no longer a fighting force. It was a memory. Its airfields across France and Belgium were littered with the skeletons of burned-out fighters, rows of twisted metal that once symbolized Germany's pride. The Allies, meanwhile, had advanced so far and so fast that their greatest challenge was logistical, not tactical, keeping pace with their own success. From the newly captured airfields near Paris, Allied aircraft now ranged deep into Germany itself. The 8th Air Force bombed oil plants and factories in the Ruhr by day. The RAF continued the assault by night. The strategy was relentless and self-reinforcing. Every bomb dropped weakened the next layer of resistance. Every destroyed train or bridge multiplied the chaos below. And yet the true measure of victory was not destruction. It was production. In Washington, the War Department compiled figures that astonished even those who had ordered them. From 1940 to mid-1944, the United States had manufactured over 104,000 aircraft for combat service, not counting trainers and prototypes. When spare engines, drop tanks, and gliders were included, the number exceeded 150,000. No empire in history had ever mobilized such mechanical power. This was not just a triumph of scale, but of integration. Aircraft built in Los Angeles were fitted with engines from Detroit, propellers from Hartford, radios from Chicago, and instruments from New York. Every American state, every industrial hub, contributed a piece. Even the smallest subcontractor, the maker of a single bolt or hydraulic fitting, had a role in victory. It was a system designed to outlast fatigue. When the Wehrmacht's supply lines broke, the American ones stretched further. When Germany ran out of skilled labor, the United States trained more. When fuel shortages grounded the Luftwaffe, the Allies built floating fuel depots in the Channel and pipelines across France. The strategic consequence was total freedom of movement. By September, Allied transport planes were dropping supplies to advancing armies faster than trucks could deliver them. The Red Ball Express, a convoy network feeding Patton's tanks, was supplemented by fleets of C-47s, flying daily resupply missions. The same planes that had carried paratroopers on D-Day now sustained armies. The 100,000 planes were not just statistics, they were arteries. The war machine had evolved into a living organism, its heartbeat audible in every squadron takeoff. In Berlin, the reaction was despair mixed with disbelief. Intelligence officers reported that even if the Reich increased aircraft production, it would never matter. Germany no longer had fuel, trained pilots, or time. General Adolf Galland, one of the Luftwaffe's last surviving aces, described the moment bluntly. "We had lost the air, and once you lose the air, you lose the war." By the time Allied troops reached the German border in late 1944, the skies were almost serene. There were no dogfights, no mass raids to repel. The Luftwaffe, once Europe's terror, had simply vanished. In its place roamed unchallenged Allied patrols, mapping, photographing, and preparing for the final assault into the Reich. The legacy of that dominance reached beyond victory. The lessons of 1944 became the blueprint for modern warfare: industrial coordination, strategic logistics, and complete air-ground integration. The U.S. had demonstrated that victory could be engineered, measured, and mass-produced. The numbers themselves tell the story better than any superlative. Between 1941 and 1945, the U.S. built nearly 300,000 aircraft. On the day of D-Day, it had already produced more than one-third of that total. For every plane Germany sent into battle, America sent 5. For every pilot the Luftwaffe trained, the U.S. trained 10. It wasn't courage or genius alone that won the skies. It was continuity. The ability to never stop building, never stop flying, never stop adapting. By war's end, the ruins of Europe would testify to both the destructive and creative power of that system. The Allies had turned industry itself into a weapon, and in doing so, changed warfare forever. The German commanders who once mocked America's assembly line airmen were gone, their armies shattered. In their place stood a new vision of power, not rooted in mystique or ideology, but in production, precision, and perseverance. And high above the Rhine, American bombers flew home in formation, their shadows passing over the silent factories of the Reich, proof that the sky now belonged to those who could build it. The German High Command had once believed that spirit could defeat industry, that courage, training, and will could outmatch factories and machines. In June 1944, that belief died. The U.S. Army Air Forces did not merely win air superiority, they redefined it. They turned the concept of war itself from valor to volume, from aces to algorithms, from singular heroism to synchronized precision. The figure, 100,000 planes before D-Day, was not simply a statistic. It was a statement of civilization. It said that democracy could organize itself for total war without losing its humanity. It proved that the minds designing wings in Seattle and the hands riveting panels in Michigan were as vital to victory as the pilots flying over Normandy. Every aircraft in that armada carried with it not just bombs, but the combined will of a free people learning to think in systems. When historians later asked how the Allies achieved the impossible, the answer was simple. They learned to scale courage. A single German ace might shoot down 20 planes, but 20,000 American engineers could design 20 more before the week was out. The war of attrition had become a war of regeneration, and only one side could regenerate infinitely. The skies over France in 1944 were the first true glimpse of modern warfare, where logistics was strategy, where production equaled power, where control of the air meant control of history. When the surviving German generals looked up that summer and saw the endless formations overhead, they weren't just witnessing defeat. They were seeing the future, a future where wars would be won not by the few, but by the many, not by genius, but by process. From the roar of those engines rose the defining lesson of the century, that strength, when organized, becomes destiny. And as the last bombers return to their bases in England, their silhouettes fading into the dawn, the world they left behind was forever changed. The era of the Luftwaffe had ended. The age of air power had begun.